Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something that is, well, it's both fundamental and at the same time often invisible.
It really is.
We're looking at this incredible source material you shared on the psychology of prejudice and discrimination, specifically the parts focused on gender, gender identity, and sexual orientation. And this isn't just about understanding, individual biases. It's about mapping the entire system. Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission here is to really clearly define the terminology, get the words right, and then explore these powerful, pervasive systems of belief. I think the researchers call it the gender belief system.
That's the one. And you called it an architecture before, and that's the perfect word for it. This framework is like the invisible operating system of society.
An operating system. I like that.
Yeah, and the sources, they lay out this gender belief system as a remarkably complex structure. Its power comes from this dual nature it has.
Yeah.
It's both descriptive, telling us what traits are associated with men and women.
Okay, like a set of labels.
Exactly. But then, and this is the critical part, it's also prescriptive. It tells us what traits men and women should have. And we're going to trace exactly how those shoulds, those prescriptive beliefs, translate into prejudice, into discrimination against women, transgender people, and sexual minorities.
Right. It sounds like we absolutely have to start with the vocabulary then, the basics.
We have to.
Because when these conversations get heated, it feels like it's often because people are using the same words to mean totally different things. We just need some clarity.
Precisely. We can sort of establish a clear hierarchy of terms, starting with biology. So the sources define sex as the biological status assigned at birth.
So male, female, based on physical traits.
Right. Typically. And then from that biological foundation, we step into the social part.
Which is gender.
Yes. Gender is all these social, cultural, psychological, behavioral attributes that a society connects to those biological sexes. It's what we label masculine and feminine.
So it's the learned stuff, the roles, the expectations.
All the learned stuff. And so if sex is what you're assigned and gender is what society expects of you, that brings us to gender identity.
Which is the internal piece, right?
Entirely internal. It's your deeply held personal sense of being a man, a woman, non-binary, neither. It's who you know you are. And that distinction is vital.
Why is it so vital?
Because it lets us define who is, living in alignment with what society expects and who is not.
Okay, and that brings us to two really essential terms that are all over the sources.
Yes.
Cisgender and transgender.
Exactly. A cisgender person is someone whose gender identity aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth. It fits comfortably.
Then transgender.
A transgender person is someone who's assigned sex at birth just, incorrectly or incompletely, describes their deeply felt gender identity. And this is really where that gender belief system starts to enforce its prescriptive rules.
And crucially, we have to separate all of that from sexual orientation.
Oh, absolutely. Completely separate. Sexual orientation has nothing to do with your gender identity. It's about who you're attracted to. Emotionally, romantically, sexually. So gay, straight, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, that whole spectrum.
Okay. I feel like we have the personal identity terms locked down. Now let's move to the systems of bias the material talks about. Because these aren't just, individual feelings, they're bigger.
They're institutionalized forces.
Okay.
Correct. The sources detail three interlocking systems of oppression. The first is sexism.
The one we hear about most often.
Right. And it's defined as systemic discrimination directed against women. It's interpersonal, institutional, cultural.
Yeah.
All of it works to maintain male dominance.
And the second one targets gender identity.
That would be anti-transgender prejudice. It's the specific negative bias, the hostility against transgender people. It's sometimes also called cisgenderism.
Cisgenderism, what does that mean exactly?
It's the ideological belief that being cisgender is the only correct or normal way to be. It centers all of our institutions, all our resources around that single identity, making everything else invisible or wrong.
Got it. And then finally, the third big one, heterosexism.
Yeah.
You mentioned this is bigger than just homophobia.
Much bigger. Heterosexism is the ideological system that sets heterosexuality as the default, the norm, the ideal.
So it's not necessarily active hate?
Not always, no.
Yeah.
It's more like the invisible structure. It's the assumption in every form Yes. These are the two pillars of gender stereotypes. So for men, you have the agentic cluster.
Agentic?
Also called the competence cluster. These are traits all about getting things done, being independent, strong, assertive, self-confident. It describes the doer.
Okay, so the doer. And for women?
For women, It's the communal cluster,
Yeah.
or the warmth-expressive cluster. These traits are about social connection, about support. So being emotional, helpful, kind, focused on relationships.
The helper or nurturer.
Exactly. And it's important to remember these stereotypes cover, well, everything. Roles, physical appearance, cognitive abilities, even which emotions you're allowed to show.
You know, what really stands out to me is just how opposed these two clusters are meant to be.
That opposition is key. It's a psychological concept called gender polarization.
Polarization.
It's the fundamental, often implicit belief that what is masculine cannot be feminine and what's feminine cannot be masculine. It forces this really strict binary separation.
So if you're good at the agentic stuff, the assumption is you must be bad at the communal stuff.
You must be. That rigidity is what locks traditional gender roles in place.
And the research shows this system is just incredibly durable. The sources say these stereotypes are consistent across age, region, and time. They're just universal and stable.
They are, but here's where it gets really interesting. This is a key insight that a lot of people miss.
Okay.
These deep-seated stereotypes. They generally mirror the characteristics that men and women actually use to describe themselves.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying the stereotypes are accurate?
They're generally accurate at the group level. If you survey 1,000 men and 1,000 women, the average self-descriptions will pretty much align with those agentic and communal clusters. But, and this is the huge caveat, they are not necessarily accurate at the individual level.
Okay, so it's like, if I know the average height for a group, I still know absolutely nothing about the height of the individual person standing next to me.
That is the perfect analogy. The problem with prejudice is that people take that group-level statistical accuracy and they just apply it universally to an individual, ignoring everything that makes them unique.
So the stability of the stereotype doesn't justify using it on a single person.
Never. That's a crucial distinction.
Let's talk about how this polarization really impacts the perception of women, because it feels complicated. The source material brings up the women are wonderful effect. It suggests that the basic social category of woman is actually viewed more positively than man. How does that work?
Well, that positive feeling, that effect, is the essential ingredient for what's called the discrimination-affection paradox.
Discrimination-affection paradox. Okay, break that down.
So on one hand, society views women positively. That's the affection part. But at the same time, they still experience this pervasive, negative, systemic discrimination.
So being liked doesn't mean you get respect or power.
Not at all. It shows that being liked is not the same as being seen as competent or as a leader.
And this paradox shows up in the two forms of modern sexism we need to differentiate, right?
Yes, the two sides of the same coin. Hostile sexism and benevolent sexism.
Hostile sexism sounds pretty straightforward.
It is. It's the overt negative set of beliefs that actively punish women who defy traditional roles. The women who are seen as too agentic, too ambitious, too loud.
Okay, but benevolent sexism, it sounds kinder, but the sources imply it's maybe even more insidious.
It is, because it's the affection part of the paradox. Benevolent sexism is made up of these seemingly positive, protective beliefs. The idea that women are delicate, that they need to be cherished, that they should be the moral center of the home.
And it feels good to be cherished.
It often feels positive because it rewards women who stick to those traditional communal roles. But that protection comes at the cost of freedom and agency. That's this psychological justification for limiting women's opportunities.
And I see the direct line from that to the workplace obstacles. We talk about the sticky floor a lot. Those jobs traditionally held by women admin roles, care roles, that just don't offer much of a path for advancement.
That's the structural reinforcement.
Yeah.
Women are flooding into higher education and the workplace, but gender segregation is still a huge issue. Benevolent sexism rationalizes why women should be in jobs that offer stability and support, not high risk and high reward.
And if they do aim higher, they hit the classic glass ceiling, that invisible barrier.
Right, but the sources actually update that model a bit with the idea of the labyrinth.
The labyrinth.
Yeah. The idea is that the obstacles haven't disappeared, they're just more complex now, they're numerous, they're less visible. So a path to the top might exist, but it's really hard to find. It's full of winding turns, and it requires constant course correction just to navigate all these conflicting expectations.
And the psychological engine driving all of this, the labyrinth, the ceiling, is something called Role Congruity Theory.
Absolutely. This is where the agentic and communal clusters just collide head on. Well, prejudice happens because a female leader is simultaneously violating two sets of expectations. She's violating the expectation of what a leader should be, which is agentic, and what a woman should be, which is communal. She's trying to reconcile two opposing rules.
And if she leans too far into the agentic side, if she's assertive, competitive, demanding all the things you need to be a leader, she runs right into the backlash effect.
That's the penalty for violating the prescription. Women who display these stereotypically male traits, they experience tangible negative reactions, social rejection, lower hiring rates, worse performance evaluations.
They're being penalized for being competent.
Exactly. It creates an impossible double bind. Be traditionally feminine and seem incompetent for the job, or be competent for the job and suffer social rejection.
And before we move on, we have to acknowledge that men face restrictive rules too. The male gender role demands this intense hypermasculinity.
A very narrow script.
Yeah, you have to be tough, stoic, fiercely reject anything seen as feminine.
And that standard leads to some really profound negative consequences. The sources point out that manhood is precarious. It's seen as something that's hard to win and very easy to lose.
So there's constant pressure.
Constant pressure. And it leads to things like low self-esteem when you fail to meet that impossible standard. And significantly, it strongly correlates with anti-gay prejudice. It becomes a way to defend your own challenged masculine status.
Okay, let's pivot now to how these prescriptive gender beliefs specifically affect marginalized groups, starting with anti-transgender prejudice.
Right. Attitudes toward transgender individuals are directly linked to the enforcement of gender polarization. The whole system prescribes that your biological sex must match your gender identity.
And people who defy that are challenging the entire foundation.
They are, and they become targets of bias for it.
And the real-world impact of that challenge is, it's shocking.
It is. People who are transgender report extraordinarily high rates of harassment and violence. And if we just look at the professional world, the source material had a really sobering fact.
What was
30% of transgender adults report having experienced discrimination at work. And microaggressions, the subtle daily slights, they're incredibly common.
30%? Wow. That shows this isn't isolated at all. It's systemic.
It's a systemic failure to integrate. And that makes the whole discussion around language really fascinating.
Yeah, the source mentioned that just using they as a gender-neutral pronoun isn't always a perfect solution because it can still prompt a mental image of a man.
Right. Language reinforces bias. But it can also change it. The sources point to the successful adoption of the pronoun hen in Swedish.
Hen?
Yeah, it's a widely used and recognized gender-neutral pronoun, and research actually shows that its use helps reduce that default mental bias that favors men. People start to consider women and non-binary individuals more often in abstract thought.
So that's concrete proof that a conscious change in language can slowly chip away at unconscious bias.
Exactly.
Let's move to heterosexism and sexual prejudice. How does gender polarization play out here?
Well, here, the stereotypes are almost entirely driven by perceived gender nonconformity. The common stereotype for gay men is that they possess feminine traits.
And for lesbians, that they have masculine traits.
Right. They're seen as crossing that gender line. And this feeds directly into what researchers call the sexual orientation hypothesis.
Okay, what does that hypothesis predict?
It predicts that because gender nonconformity is so noticeable, people are far more likely to believe a feminine man is gay than they are to believe a masculine woman is lesbian.
So a man acting feminine is a much stronger trigger for that assumption.
A much stronger, faster association with non-heterosexuality, yes.
And what about attitudes toward bisexuality? That seems to have its own set of complicated stereotypes.
It does. Bisexual individuals are often stereotyped as being in a transitory phase or just being confused. It reflects a refusal to accept that identity as stable or legitimate.
And the sources note that these negative attitudes don't just come from heterosexual people.
That's a crucial point. They are also held by some gay men and lesbians, who sometimes enforce their own rigid binary model of orientation.
So if we're looking for the bright spots, who is most accepting of these groups?
The patterns in the research are really clear and consistent. It's individuals who are younger, more educated, female, less politically conservative, and who score lower on measures of authoritarianism. They're generally the most accepting of everyone.
The fact that these identities often exist in such a hostile system, it leads to this profound psychological challenge for so many people, the element of choice in self-disclosure. So what does this all mean for daily life?
It means that homosexuality is what's called a concealable stigma.
A concealable stigma.
Right. Unlike, say, your race, You can often choose to pass as heterosexual, but that choice has this massive hidden cost. Not disclosing means you're constantly calculating, you're hiding casual details, who you live with, who you saw a movie with.
That just sounds exhausting. It's the difference between never having to think about it and performing a constant editing process on your own life.
That is the very essence of heterosexual privilege. Heterosexual people never have to make that continuous energy-draining choice.
So the decision to come out it's incredibly complex.
It is, because of tangible fears. Social rejection, losing your job, losing family support, even physical violence. And the data shows those fears are sadly grounded in reality.
Which makes sense why people would strategically look for safe spaces, especially at work.
Absolutely. The research highlights what makes for a safer environment. The presence of other openly gay people, clear institutional policies that are gay-friendly, and living in places with strong anti-discrimination laws. Policy can really mitigate the psychological burden.
And when we pull all the way back, we see this entire conversation from stereotypes about women to prejudice against sexual minorities. It's all tied together. It's all part of this one hierarchy that's driven by the gender belief system.
That is the final critical synthesis. The GBS establishes a status quo that privileges three specific groups and maintains a hierarchy of power. And these are the three pillars driving the whole system. Androcentrism, which is centering society around men. Cisgenderism, centering society around cisgender individuals. And heterosexism, centering society around heterosexual individuals. When we understand the prescriptive rules of the GBS, we understand why these three groups are perpetually placed at the top of that hierarchy.
This has really been a deep dive into the powerful forces that reinforce tradition. From the basics, like gender polarization, all the way to the insidious nature of that discrimination-affection paradox. We've defined the whole system, both the descriptive parts and, more importantly, the prescriptive parts that tell us what we should be.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, understanding that this gender belief system is pervasive, that it's deeply ingrained, and that it's constantly prescribing behavior, well, that's the indispensable first step. It's the first step toward critically thinking about the world we live in and recognizing where these overwhelming expectations truly come from.
You know, something that's sticking with me, we noted earlier that perceptions show women are becoming more agentic over time, which sounds like progress, right?
It does, on the surface.
But the source material also showed that people's perception of men's traits, both agentic and communal, are largely unchanged over that same time period. So what does that gap, the prediction of change for one group but stability for the other, what does that tell us about society's unconscious limits on gender roles, even when progress seems so evident? Does the system only allow women to change to meet men's standards without demanding any corresponding change from men? Something for you to consider long after this deep dive ends?